All right, so now we're going to end the war. We spent some time talking about Russia pulling out of the war. We spent some time talking about how great the war was. And now what we're going to focus on is we're going to focus on the ending to the violence, and we're going to focus on that for today's lesson. All right, so in the spring, or rather summer of 1917, the United States finally began sending troops into the war. Now, we had made the declaration of war months earlier, and now we began actually getting troops there. And so we didn't actually do a whole lot of fighting in the war. And as we'll see in the end result, we didn't have a whole lot of casualties in the war. But what we did help was we provided extra morale. We did provide extra military weapons all throughout the years. But now we provide a lot of moral help. And now that the Americans are there, everybody seems to think, all right, now we're going to win the war. The tide begins to turn against the Central Powers. And in the fall of 1918, what happens with the help of the Americans, and the Allied powers begin making offenses. First begins the Ottoman empires begin to pull out. And then the Bulgarians, and then the Ottoman empires pull out. And finally in October, the Austro-Hungarian country faces a revolution in their country, and their government loses power, and the new government of Austria-Hungary signs a treaty that says, hey, we're getting out of the war. It signs a ceasefire that says we're getting out of the war. Well, the only country left fighting at this point is Germany. Now, if you'll remember, Russia was not fighting in it as well, but the Germans are still fighting. They're still continuing to wage this war, and they just keep going on and on and on. Well, finally, on November 9th, in 1918, there is a revolution in Germany, and the military revolts against their government, against Kaiser William, and they overthrow the government. And finally, 2 days later, they sign a ceasefire ending the war. On the 11th day of the 11th hour of the 11th month. So on November 11th, at 11 a.m., the Germans sign a ceasefire that say, hey, we're stopping the war. It's an armistice. It stops. That's why Veterans Day is on November 11th, is because that was originally Armistice Day, the war or the end to the fighting in World War I. And so the war is finally over. The Germans finally get out of the war. The Allies finally have the victory that they want. And now, so we can take a look and we can figure out what really made this the Great War. What made it the Great War was several things. One, if you look at the chart right there, there were a tremendous number of lives lost. Russia lost 1.7 million. Germany lost almost 1.8 million people. Okay, that's from one country. France lost 1.4 or almost 1.4. Austria-Hungary lost 1.2 million. The Ottoman Empire faced significant losses, but not as much. Bulgaria lost a little bit less than the United States, but if you think about it, they're a much smaller nation than the United States is, much smaller population. And so Russia and Germany bared the brunt, and Austria-Hungary and France bared the brunt of this war. And they had lost a lot of lives. What made it truly a great war was that death and destruction had not been seen on this scale ever in the history of the world. So now that we have, if you look at it, we've got several million, almost 10 million people have died or been casualties as a part of this war. And that's what makes this great. Or not so great as the case may be. And that's why it's called the Great War. So now the Allies have to get together and they have to decide, okay, are we going to be peaceful or are we going to exact vengeance? Okay, Germany, remember, was the last one fighting the war. And so a lot of people blame them for not only beginning the war, but they also blame them for pursuing the war and continuing. So following the signing of the armistice, 4 countries got together, the big 4. The U.S., with the leadership of Woodrow Wilson, Clemenceau under the leadership of France, David Lloyd George from Britain met, and Vittorio Orlando from Italy. They all got together and they said, okay, we have to decide how we are going to treat the Germans, okay? And so they now go and they meet at Versailles in Paris, and they said, okay, we're going to come up with a plan. Now remember, Woodrow Wilson had his theory or his treaty of his 14 points, and he had a plan. So everybody was expecting a piece of justice, not a piece of vengeance. Okay, so they were not expecting a piece of vengeance here. So they got together, and I'll go back to that in a second. They got together, and everybody was expecting peace, especially Germany. Well, what happens wasn't quite so much that. So the Allies get together in the Hall of Mirrors on June 28th in 1919, and what is ratified there is the Treaty of Versailles. And there are a couple of major points to the Treaty of Versailles. Number one, it forces Germany to accept sole responsibility for the war. Now, were they really solely responsible? What role did the Russians, what role did the Serbians and the Austro-Hungarians play in it? Well, the Treaty of Versailles forced them to accept sole responsibility, basically saying, hey, you are the ones that caused this war, and so this is you. Also, it forced the Germans, not so much the others, it forced the Germans to make what are called war reparation payments. These are basically payments made to pay the Allies back for the war and for what happened after the war. So those are a couple of the key points of the Treaty of Versailles, and we're going to read some parts of the Treaty of Versailles, and that lays a lot of harsh feelings from the Germans, okay? The Treaty of Versailles also dramatically redrew the map of the world. So let's go back and let's take a look real quick. This is the war, Europe rather, as it existed before World War I. Now, if you'll remember, back to Wilson's points, he essentially said that people should be allowed self-determination. They should be able to determine for themselves what form of government and to rule themselves, okay? And so the redrawing of the map played a tremendous role. Austria-Hungary were split into two separate countries. Austria and Hungary were created. Some people were happy with that, and obviously some were not. The map of the Middle East was also dramatically redrawn. Bulgaria lost a lot of land in this, Okay, and they were greatly reduced because, again, they had fought on the side of the Central Powers, and the Central Powers were the losers. The Middle East was the group that faced the biggest or most significant change outside of Europe. The Balkan Peninsula in Austria-Hungary was divided up, and we'll look at that in just a second. But the Middle East was completely redrawn. Ottoman Empire ceased to exist. Remember, the Ottoman Empire controlled most of what we consider the Middle East today. Well, following this, there was created a system of what are called mandates, and we'll look at those more in the next unit. But these mandates were divided up. And what happened was that a lot of people were not happy with this. Okay, they had been promised or thought they were going to be promised self-determination, and they were many ethnic groups, particularly in the Balkan Peninsula and in the Middle East, said, hey, I think we're going to get a say in our own government, but that wasn't the case. And so there were a lot of people that were not satisfied. The Balkan Peninsula and the peoples in the Middle East, the Syrians, the Iraqis, the Lebanese in the Middle East, even the Ottomans were not happy with that situation. The Palestinians were not happy with what happened following the Treaty of Versailles because they did not get their promised self-rule or self-governance. And we're going to take a look at more at that later. But take a look at the map. So here is Europe after Versailles. We see Poland as a new country, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania as a new country. A new country is created called Czechoslovakia, which doesn't exist anymore, but it was created in the wake and the destruction of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was divided up. Romania gained land. Bulgaria lost land. Yugoslavia is created. The Serbians and the people in the Balkan Peninsula are like, yeah, we're going to get our own government. And that doesn't wind up to be the case. And so a lot of people are unhappy with that. We'll talk more about that as we get into the next role and talking about what happens after World War I. But that's how the map changed, and those are the consequences of World War I. Bye.